Hey guys, I'm Andrei, a certified translator and a tour guide. Today we're talking about top 10 sites in Belarus. Generally, Belarusians would tell you, go to this museum, have a look at this place, maybe try potato pancakes, that would be it. Your program filled for a day. But after 10 years in the field, I came to discover that Belarus has a wealth of attractions, monuments of architecture, monuments in general, natural places that you may want to see, and there's at least a week to spend here in Belarus taking great pictures and having nice experience. If you have been to Belarus already, suggest your favorite site underneath this video in the comments. Maybe we will revise the rating and redo our top 10. Thank you for staying with the channel. As the wheels of fortune were rolling in the early 1900s, First War was followed by a pretty brutal revolution that split the history and split the society pretty badly. A lot of owners of these luxury manors were expelled or destroyed, and a lot of heritage was destroyed because it was deemed wrong and corrupt, and so on and so forth. For this reason, Western Belarus has more architectural luxury and splendor to offer, because here the Soviet Union, our ancestors who didn't believe in God, arrived basically after the war. Of course, 1939 takeover by the Soviet Union is another arguable point, but they were here shortly before the war, and some of their ways, including pretty bad deportations of the aristocrats, and in the West they are often Polish rooted guys, that had definitely left an impact on the country's area, western area, and the country's heritage. But God bless, some of the properties here were spared from the grim fate of their peers on the eastern side, and with some restoration money from the 90s and 2000s they make a great combination for a tour. Technically, when the castle was there in the 1600s, the place looked entirely different. The looks we're getting here now are from the mid-1700s. The whole place was very thoroughly demolished by our Swedish friends in the 1700s during the Northern War, so technically it's the late 1600s castle, but it's also a mid-18th century palace, a UNESCO heritage site. One of the most prominent museums in the country, a branch of the National Art Gallery, which is in Minsk. The place has quite a few exhibits, and if you are into museums, this is definitely a place to visit. The original restoration in the 1990s and 2000s took 12 very long years, basically more than that if we take into account some improvements that followed after that. But Niasvizh Castle offers about 20 rooms dedicated to different themes, different aspects from the castle life and from our history. The most prominent ones are the Golden Room, the Hunting Lounge, and a couple of others. You'll decide for yourself which ones you like more, but the general idea to keep in mind is most of the artifacts you're seeing are not really the original exhibits from the castle, because it survived 2 world wars and other times of unrest, including 1812 war and basically the revolution. So after these you don't really expect to have too many original items inside the castle, but still there are some. In Niasvizh, the Church of the Divine Body, also a piece of the UNESCO heritage, is not to be missed. It's one of the oldest functioning churches. It was never repurposed or closed or demolished naturally. And now, after the several years long restoration, it's again open. Its lovely gates are open to the visitors, to the worshippers, the Catholics. The place is Catholic, and it makes another great stop, especially when there's an organ concert. I'm not sure if they are frequent, but this is something you can investigate as well, and time to include in your program. one of the top bonuses of the place is the national cuisine served down below in the cellar. It's not an authentic restaurant that was sitting here for the last 300 years. The place had its ups and downs, so it's hard to track the original dining room. And it's the place's highlight in my personal taste. The music is a bit on the brutal side, but you get Wi-Fi and comforts and the whole variety of things to experience the national cuisine. The main things to try here are, of course, borscht, and the cold soup based on beetroot is kvass. It normally is perfect with baked potatoes, and kvass, brewed drink, but it's not really alcoholic. It's based on bread fermentation. The castle has had its glorious twists and turns. I mean, nothing remarkably devastating, terrific. There were a couple of fights, but generally we can't remember any 300 Spartans kind of stories around here. Maybe that's why it survived as a whole building. In the early 1900s, one of the last owners started the restoration, and he almost succeeded before he died in 1938. So, if you were to ask my opinion, the museum over here is kind of bleak. It has an interesting Jewish section because the Mir population was more than by half Jewish before the war. And some people who are interested in that kind of heritage or who have actual lineage to Mir may find that interesting. Otherwise, most of the historic artifacts were in Niasvizh, and here I find mostly copies. If you have kids along and you are looking for some kind of adventure thing, maybe the climbing bit, maybe of some kind of attraction. It's a separate ticket to get the climb from the prison cell into the tower and back. It's kind of funny that these days you need a ticket into prison, but this is one of the entertainments. If you're short of time and it's just the castles, then the town of Mir makes a great walk and a great collection of village landscapes for your short trip. Here you can experience how the locals live. It's a bigger village, I would say. It's more like on the town side. At least you don't want to tell the locals it's a village. But still, there is still a thing with village houses, wooden vegetable gardens, old ladies doing their things, flowers, cabbages, potatoes. So this is something you can enjoy around the year. Walking down these streets, as it turns out, is the best way to interact with the locals, people who are on the older side, people who are less complicated than their urban peers, and people who will be eager to start a conversation and tell you their opinion, if the older times were any better, if life was any easier during the Soviet times, what were the pros and cons of the system. This is one of the best moments of a village walk. Somewhere around the castles you may feel like staying for the night. You may pick one of the castle hotels which has its romantic touch. But if you are more into real stuff, into staying in a real village by a forest, my Farmstay Forest Inn is at your full service. The place is located 1 hour away from Minsk. It's basically inside the forest, so walking to see some wildlife is just a matter of minutes. And if you feel like taking a good solid breakfast next morning to charge your batteries before Brest or Grodno, that's the best place. If you care for religion, if you care for the culture, you may stop by this sweet Gothic church in Ishkaldz. village a few kilometers away off the M1 highway, and have a look at the church from the mid-1400s that has changed its denomination several times, and that was never significantly rebuilt. It was never made a dance hall, it was never made a library. It was always a church, but of course it had to stop operations during the Soviet times. An interesting story about this church dates back to the Soviet times. They say somewhere in the 50s, when Khrushchev took power, the Soviet government was waging a war against Christianity, against religion generally. So the churchware was collected from the church here while people were away in the field at work, and people had to work really hard back then to survive, to get paid miserably often. So people were tipped off by some boy. So they came up here, and after arguing a little bit with the party bosses, they were in the truck way. People basically lay on the street, and the communist bosses were ordering the driver to run them over. He got out of the truck, handed over the keys and said, well, you want to run them over? Get into the car and run them over. Nothing happened, of course, and the church ware was unloaded and returned back into the church, where services were renewed in the 1980s. If your timing and transportation are flexible, and if you happen to be in Ishkaldz for the church, stop by the village. It's a great place. I find it very fascinating. You know, I like history pretty much, history in its original form, and this place, although it's fading like many other villages in Belarus and across the world, by the way, this place still has the old-time layout. It has the old-time 1930s rock street. It doesn't have asphalt, and it doesn't need to have asphalt because the street is still solid. And it's interesting that some of the things here are still here, although some houses are abandoned. The the houses feature details that museum people seek to restore. Over here they're still on exhibit at your own disposal, without any entrance fee, by the way. From the very old times, the peasants were trying to use arable land in the most effective way, so they grouped up buildings next to one another. Here we have the shed for the cattle, the sledge, the cart and everything. The big hardware was stored there. There was man's realm, except the cow was the woman's responsibility. And over here we have the house extended into another storeroom where people kept something they used more frequently daily and around the year, because most of the big stuff was used during the field season between April and September, October. So over here everything is not like the man left yesterday, but guys, this is a really amazing place, and if one is looking for what they call it rustic places, this is a rustic place. Most likely on the way to the national park you may stop at the town of Kamianets. The so-called White Tower, or the Kamianets Tower from the 1300s, remembers the visits of our, let's say, Western partners, mostly Crusaders, and then those who followed, and that's another very symbolic, very landmark, historic point to stop by. It doesn't offer much. The museum out there is not overwhelming, though you can try and get the tickets just for the sake of the panoramic view of the rooftop, of the tower top. The tower from the 1300s is an interesting, though just a episodal stop on the way to the national park, another UNESCO site. And although the tower behind me is just a UNESCO candidate, it still makes an interesting artifact for those who are fond of history. The town itself isn't really like authentic or middle-aged kind of in its spirit. There are a lot of upgrades to the local homes, but still a walk around here, left and right, the streets out here by the church, by the tower, they make a really nice walk. National Park, Bielaviezha Pusha. Pusha is the ancient Belarusian word for a thicket. Indeed, it is a primeval European forest, as Europeans were chopping their forests actively. This one became a protected territory. Kings, Grand Dukes of Lithuania, Russian Tsars, Secretary Generals of the Communist Party all tried to make a good use of this place. Mostly they had a passion of hunting, and this in its own way was helping the forest to basically become what it is, except for a few rounds of invasions, including the First World War, when our German friends essentially had procured as much timber as the ancestors had throughout the previous 300 years, over just a couple of years of occupation. So after this, the Poles did some chopping, and then in the Soviet times they handed over 1/10 of the area to the Poles after the war, and the Belarusian side over here became a preserve, hunting preserve for the Secretary Generals of the party. To leave UNESCO badge and the other compliments aside, this is a forest, and there are two options, two major options, two ways to go. First one is you come in here and do a tour, either join a group tour or do the private walk like we do here. There are two environmental tracks, and the walking tracks are the best option if your walking battery is very good. This is just for you, and in my subjective opinion, this is the best way to go to explore the place, to take a good green walk, have some fresh air before a very good filling national cuisine bite. You will not see any bisons on this walk or any other events unless you specifically stay at some farmstay, and the locals or the preserve guys will take you for a ride in the early morning to some feeding spots where bisons do show up. It's a separate entertainment thing, and it's a separate cost. The bisons you can perfectly see in my forest, north of Forest Inn, mostly in autumn or in winter time, and the bisons you can see in Grodno. We'll talk about this a bit later. Like any other place, even run by the state, these guys have to earn money. So they have this rather massive attraction, Belarusian Santa Claus, Grandfather Frost is the proper title, which is a more exciting thing, I would say, from my rather subjective point of view, in winter time when there are kids, and that's more like a show thing. There's also a bunch of open-air cages where you can see that nervous wolf dashing between the sides of a pretty spacious place, but I guess he would have traded it for a larger area and maybe a few visitors for a lunch. And there is also this craftsman's village, which is definitely a no-no from my point of view. Again, I may be spoiled by attractions, but not this place. And definitely the national cuisine restaurant that welcomes you right at the gate. Whatever you have there, definitely give a try to a shot of cranberry juice. So guys, basically speaking, if I had my own pick, I just had my own pick, I would have opted for this walk thing here. The next tempting option is a bicycle ride, and it really takes you to those nice places, the Tsar era bridge and the other things like the 600-year-old oak. But bicycles out there by the parking are maybe from the times of the last Tsar. So not an option, not an option as long as you can't learn how to drive a Soviet era bicycle without any speeds or anything. If you're old-fashioned like me, you could take one of those, but not a practical option. Khatyn is one of the heaviest places to be in Belarus. It's not really a tourist attraction or a highlight, it's just a site. Memorial was built on the site of a village, that was destroyed along with the people who lived there. They were non-combatants, so it's not a story of a battlefield or some grand battle, defeat, offense. It's about people who were pressed between the two parties fighting, pronouncing whatever great ideas they had to fight for, the civilians who had to survive somehow and who were burnt alive. Since Khatyn was unveiled in 1969, millions of people came over here to hear the story about the Eastern Front. You know, since the 1940s, the two fighting sides had their own history to write, their Cold War to fight. So to many it was a surprise. Many American, many EU visitors, British visitors, about how the war worked out over here, how it was for Belarusians, how it was for, let's say, Soviet people of Belarus. They were multinational, they were Jews, they were Russians, Polish, Belarusians themselves, of course. And many just find this one of the most memorable sites in the country. If I were to draw a program for your visit in Belarus, I would definitely include Khatyn, and maybe if you don't want to take a professional tour guide along, I would recommend to visit it with somebody local. Maybe you're visiting a friend, or maybe you meet somebody here and ask them to show you the place and share their ideas about this. And maybe share their family stories, because now 4 generations away there are just some family stories to share on top of what you read on the internet. A walk through the deserted streets of a village that once was full of life can get you think about how humans can be so unhuman, and how can they do things beyond comprehension of a civilized man. And yet all the civilized men do the stuff that we're reading in today's headlines, or have been reading between 1940s headlines and today. It's a very strong side, guys. In my personal opinion, Brest Fortress makes perhaps one of the top military monuments of Belarus, one of the top sites to visit in general. It's tragic in several aspects. The history of almost a 200-year-old fortress basically is printed over the history of a 600-year-old city of Brest. The city was leveled in the 1800s to give way to the fortress. Then in the 1930s, in 1939, as the Second World War was progressing, outnumbered Poles were fighting here against the Soviets and the Nazi that were pressing them from two sides, mostly from the Nazi. And then in 1941, the fortress that was not even meant to fight gave the world, gave the largest European army an example of how the war must be fought. This story of the 1941 defense of the fortress that was not meant to be defended is my point here. Today, at this place, at this site, which is very emotional to me personally, the story is about 2,000 men and some women that were fighting a clearly larger force, and that opted to not give up at any cost, at the cost of their lives, and to be loyal to their duty to the end, to the very end. Well, this is the central part of the fortress, the citadel, and it's the central part of the museum. But as you walk around, as you approach it from the northern gates or from the main gates, the star gates, from the city side, you will discover there's much more to the monument. There were extensions built right after it was constructed in the 1840s. 20 years later they built fortresses, little fortresses outside, outer forts or whatever they called them. So all this, cutting edge and first class for the 1840s, was not even meant to fight in the 1940s. And the garrison of the fortress wasn't actually attached to the fortress as such. These were different units, from the border control secret service units to a music squad with basically kids and teenagers. This is about how a handful people, well, originally thousands, but as the heat and bombings and fire and other evils were shortening their numbers, in 1941 there were just several hundred men who were fighting against much larger force and much better equipped force, not necessarily better motivated. Longer than some European countries resisted against the Nazi. This is something that we should really remember. The most emotional point to me personally out of the whole memoir was the monument called Thirst. The water supply system of the fortress was disabled a few hours before the invasion started. The men were trying to get some water at any cost. It was a very hot summer. The place was literally blazing, not to mention the bombings, the dust, the sand, the flame, the other things, the other factors that forced people to use anything they had, like bottles or helmets, to try and reach the canals, which were foul with dead bodies, and get some water, often at the cost of their lives, because just across the canals there were gunners destroying, killing people who were trying to do that. Guys, I would like to nominate Grodno as a single site to visit because the place is just full of historic buildings, blocks, streets, churches. One of them is a UNESCO candidate, monasteries, one of them still an operational prison, and a lot of other niceties like these water pumping towers, one of them behind me from the First World War, from before that, civilian buildings. That all makes a terrific, delicious mix of historic heritage that is worthy one day and one night to stay, and the next morning coffee on one of those streets. This church was established in the 1100s by the Christian princes of the area. The place dates back to the 1100s, and in the 1850s we lost half of it. It collapsed into a river because of a flood. The rest, the remaining smaller part, was made operational, or was preserved and made operational as a church in the late 1980s after the Soviet Union collapsed. I'm really not very fond of different kinds of museums, but visiting an industrial site, the production of dump trucks, BELAZ, north of Minsk in the city of Grodno, one cannot avoid the history section of the place, and that's where the tour starts before you get to see all those world's biggest trucks. The Soviet factory evolved from a machinery producer for basically roadworks to a producer of dump trucks for peat industry. They claim that 130 payload trucks are world's best, competing with others. Other top producers are Caterpillar, LIDBEER and Komatsu, so the top 3 or the top 4 is often being shuffled depending on how they go, I guess especially in light of the geopolitics. If you're fond of all kinds of machinery, productions, assemblies, world's biggest this and that, metal, that's the place to be. This parking lot features one of the biggest machines in the world, a truck with 450-ton payload, and it's featured in the Guinness Book of Records.